Great. Wonderful. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Justin Baeder, and it's my privilege to share with you today and engage with you today around classroom walkthroughs. And if you have not introduced yourself yet, I would love to know who you are and what you do and roughly where you're joining us from. So again, my name is Justin Baeder. I'm the author of two books, one of which is about classroom walkthroughs. That's Now We're Talking, 21 Days to High Performance Instructional Leadership. And I have another book and some software and different tools, and I'll be sharing some tools with you today that you can take with you, some free tools that you can use to get into classrooms. In terms of some of what we're going to touch on today, we'll talk about scheduling, we'll talk about blocking off time, and if you have found that blocking off time does not consistently work for you, I'll give you some alternatives and ways to think about scheduling your time. We'll talk about some different roles that you can play in feedback conversations with teachers who are at different stages of their career and need different things from you as an instructional leader. And I see that we have people who are principals, instructional coaches, assistant principals, deputy superintendents, people in all kinds of different roles. And sometimes it's appropriate to play more of a boss role, and sometimes you want to be more consultative, more of a coach. There are just different situations that call on us to play different roles. But I find that a lot of people's experience hearing about classroom walkthroughs is purely directive. I'm the supervisor. I'm going to tell you what you did well. I'm going to tell you what you need to improve. And I think there are more options that we need to have on the table. So we'll talk about those today. We'll talk about intrinsic motivation right toward the beginning and how some of the traditional practices in classroom walkthroughs work against intrinsic motivation and what we can do to promote intrinsic motivation based on self-determination theory. We'll talk about open-ended questions that are anchored in evidence, and that is kind of the evidence-driven aspect of this approach. I'll share with you some case studies and then some best practices that have worked for lots and lots of people. And we'll talk about some of the myths and misconceptions that we need to let go of. One of the things that I should let you know about that this kind of came out of goes all the way back to 2013 when I started challenging people to get into classrooms. And I call that the Instructional Leadership Challenge. And since then, thousands and thousands of people around the world in about 50 countries have written to me to tell me what their experience has been, to tell me what their successes have been, what their struggles have been, and what they've been able to accomplish by being in classrooms. And as a result of that feedback, I've come up with 7 keys that I'm going to share with you today that make this actually a sustainable habit. And if you are interested in reading more about this, this happens to be the chapter that is free from my book on the Solution Tree website. So if you go to Solution Tree and look for this book, you can actually read this entire chapter for free, and it goes through the entire 7-part model. So feel free to do that. We're going to go through them today, but I wanted to lay all of my cards on the table at the outset and let you know what kinds of walkthroughs we're talking about, because there are a lot of different definitions of walkthroughs out there, and we even debated in putting the book together whether to call them walkthroughs, because sometimes people have baggage or different ideas of what a walkthrough should be. This is what I mean when I talk about a classroom walkthrough: a visit to a classroom that is frequent, brief, substantive, open-ended, evidence-based, criterion referenced, and conversation oriented. So that is what we will be talking about today. Again, if you're just joining us, thank you for introducing yourself. It's great to know where people are joining us from and what roles they're in. I want to start by telling you about some of the people who have gotten into classrooms 500 times a year. And full disclosure, a lot of these 7 keys I did not really figure out until after I was a principal. I did not personally get into classrooms 500 times a year and really figure out what made this sustainable. But like everyone else, I did my best. And I think probably everyone here, give me a yes in the chat if you do your best to get into classrooms in your role. I think that's kind of the universal experience is we all try, right? Like everybody tries to get into classrooms because we're supposed to. Heather says yes, Melissa says yes, Misty says yes. Yeah, we all try to get into classrooms. And yet we have this near universal experience of finding it challenging. It is never easy to get into classrooms consistently. In fact, it's so hard that I hesitate to even share that number 500 times a year, because people say, yeah, right. People are skeptical that it's actually possible. They don't believe in themselves and their ability to do it. They don't believe anybody is actually doing it. So I wanted to start by telling you about 3 specific people. 2 of these stories you can easily verify. Chris, I did not get permission to use his story, so I didn't give you Chris's last name, but he's a real principal in my state. who started as an assistant principal. But I'll tell you about Sam and Heather, and you can learn more about them if you want. I like the story of Sam. Sam Ladeau was a middle school assistant principal or junior high assistant principal, and he said to me, I'm constantly stuck in the office dealing with discipline, and I want to be more proactive. So he decided he was just going to try to spend as much time as possible in classrooms and get ahead of discipline issues. And this wasn't specifically the model I was teaching. He just was kind of inspired and decided to go for it. And he was like, I'm just going to go into classrooms every single period. And as a result, he found that there were far fewer discipline issues getting sent to the office for him to deal with, because kids would realize that he was going to be in their classroom frequently and they would act up quite a bit less. So he ended up making 1,173 classroom visits in 1 year as an assistant principal with heavy discipline responsibilities. So he was, had been in this frame of mind where it's like all day, every day is going to be discipline. And he really changed that to all day, every day is being in classrooms. Now, I'm not going to actually recommend that you spend all day, every day in classrooms. Sam was especially enthusiastic and did something that worked for him. But I hope his story is inspiring to you. And if you do want to listen to the full interview that I did with Sam a while back, you can find that at principalcenter.com/Sam. That is one of more than 400 podcast interviews that I've done. Most of them are with authors about books, but Sam's story was so good, his experience was so good that I wanted to share that here. How many people, give me a me in the chat if you deal with a lot of discipline personally, if you are constantly being called to the office to deal with discipline issues. I think you might especially like Sam's experience because he was quite busy with discipline and didn't feel like he could break out of the office. And by being in classrooms, what he was able to do is just be that presence so that when students saw him, they realized, okay, there's not really much point in acting up and getting sent to the office because Mr. Ladeau is already here. So there's Sam. Heather has become a close friend of mine. Heather was in a very small school in Canada. She had, I think, fewer than a dozen teachers, and it didn't really make sense to her in her situation to give directive feedback and to fill out forms about the teachers that she was visiting, that she worked with so closely. But she decided that she was going to take this challenge seriously of getting into classrooms 500 times a year. And she actually did it 4 years in a row. And at the end of those 4 years, she was recognized with an award. She won a regional award for her leadership, and she had been, in classrooms some 2,000 times over 4 years. And as a result, she was very in touch with what was going on in her school. She was able to support the school through the transition to full inclusion and really just be a very, very strong instructional leader. And she has since then written a book with me. So Mapping Professional Practice is my second book. We worked on that together. And she is coaching leaders now and just a tremendous leader. And then one more person I want to tell you about, because again, people don't believe that this is actually possible until they hear from people. I went back through my emails from Chris. Chris is now a high school principal in my state, and he made the decision. He talked other people into it. He talked his principal into it when he was an assistant principal, and then he got right to it. 161 visits as of the end of October, and just quickly got on pace and brought his whole district on board. He got the middle school, he got the elementary school on board, and unsurprisingly, he became the principal shortly after that. So if you have any doubt in your mind that you can get into classrooms, regardless of your situation, I want you to know there is somebody who is facing bigger challenges, who thought it was even harder than you think it is, who was able to get into classrooms by letting go of some commitments that maybe were holding them back, some things that they thought they had to do in classroom walkthroughs that aren't actually helpful, aren't actually necessary, and make it more difficult than it needs to be. So we're going to start with talking about self-determination theory a little bit, and then we'll get into the details of the 7 keys, and we'll end up with some pragmatics and practicalities. I wanted to start with self-determination theory here because I feel like sometimes we have internal resistance to getting into classrooms because we know we're doing something that does not always treat our teachers as adults, and it does not always respect their professionalism and their professional autonomy. And we feel that implicitly, but at the same time, we feel an obligation to be instructional leaders, right? There's a tension between respecting the work that people are doing and being more hands-on as an instructional leader and prompting people to grow. And I think self-determination theory is a good way to think about these issues, a good framework for thinking about teacher intrinsic motivation and how that relates to our responsibilities as school leaders. And I've written an article on this. If you're a member of NASSP, give me a yes in the chat if you're an NASSP member, a member of the National Association of Secondary School Principals. They've published several of my articles recently, and there will be one next month on this called Creating the Working Conditions That the Best Teachers Want. I love NASSP. They are always putting out great things. And this article is on intrinsic motivation, drawing on Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory, which identifies three drivers of intrinsic motivation. To be intrinsically motivated, people need a sense of autonomy, they need a sense of competence, and they need a sense of relatedness. And those came to mind for me because I think sometimes our instructional leadership practices work directly against each of them, right? If we see it as our role to tell people what to do, to tell people that they're not good enough, to divide and conquer, to distinguish people from one another and kind of isolate them from their peers, and like there are all these things that we do that can make people feel less intrinsically motivated, that are very predictable according to self-determination theory, right? So for each of those, they all, there's a double-edged sword for each of these, but I think we have to be very careful how we approach each of them. And one specific practice that virtually everybody thinks they need to do is give warm and cool feedback. Tell me which of these on the screen, tell me in the chat, which of these you have heard in your professional experience. Warm and cool feedback, right? You do a classroom walkthrough and you give warm and cool feedback. I've heard hot and cold. I've heard stars and stares. I might have made up one or two of these, but almost all of these are real things that I have heard. Glow and grow is a popular one. Yep. Kudos and critique. Wows and wonders was what we used in Seattle a lot. And I just assumed that was what you're supposed to do, right? Pretty much everybody has heard you're supposed to give warm and cool feedback. But I'm going to guess that most of us don't use warm and cool feedback in other contexts, right? Like if I load the dishwasher and my kids or my wife give me warm and cool feedback about that, I might be like, what's going on here? Like, I don't need your feedback warm and cool on how I load the dishwasher, but I am open to conversation about my judgment on that matter. And I think it's the same for teachers, that they are open to conversation. They are open to some sort of feedback, but it does not necessarily have to be warm and cool. It does not have to be positive and negative. And we especially don't need to do the thing that we always seem to want to do, which is fill out a form. And I will be the first to admit, I filled out lots of forms. I designed lots of forms. I became a principal around the time when the iPad first came out, and I thought, this is great. I can make a form on my iPad. I can fill out forms faster than anyone because I have this new device. And I thought forms were just the greatest thing until I started using them a lot and realizing this isn't really the kind of professional relationship I want to have with teachers. This isn't the right feel to be filling out forms in a professional context. And I thought about the feel that usually accompanies having a form filled out about you, right? Like when was the last time somebody else filled out a form about you and then gave it to you? I've gotten one of these. It's been a while, but it's not a great feeling, is it, to have a form filled out about you and realize, oh, I was going too fast, or I did something wrong and I need to pay the price for that. Like, this is not the metaphor. This is not the context that I want to create in my professional interactions with teachers. So I'd like to invite you to comment, just based on what we've talked about so far, how might traditional feedback practices affect teachers' sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness? I'd love to have your thoughts on that, recognizing, we've all heard that we should give warm and cool feedback. I'm not criticizing anyone for doing that. I certainly did that a lot, but I do want to challenge the idea that should be our default, that should be the main thing that we do. Kat says it's unidirectional, thus hindering self-determination. Yeah, absolutely. Ayana's asking a great question about needing something measurable to show you visited classrooms. I will give you a template that you can use to track your visits and to organize your visits, and that is a great form of evidence to show that you are getting into classrooms. Alexa says it seems impersonal. Alana says, without a conversation, we don't hear their point of view. Absolutely, absolutely. Teachers always want to say, well, here's what was going on. Here's why you saw what you saw. And often those are extremely valid comments that we do need to hear. Yeah, it creates a what did I do wrong mindset, very one-sided, focused on one individual's perspective. Absolutely. And I found that often my perspective was not the most valuable one, right? The person who is doing the work is best poised to reflect on the observation, reflect on the lesson, and identify some insights. So that puts a different light on what we can do as instructional leaders to be valuable when we get into classrooms. Thank you for your comments there. All right, so let's talk about the 7 keys themselves. And we're especially going to talk about what goes wrong when any of these is missing. And everybody said, I've tried to get into classrooms. I'm committed to getting into classrooms. I do my best to get into classrooms. I want you to think about which of these is most missing from your usual practice of getting into classrooms. If we haven't already talked about it, we will probably get into one or more things that are missing from the characteristics of your classroom walkthroughs. And the first is frequent. We've got to get into classrooms frequently if this is going to make any difference. And I found that my mental sense of how often I was getting into classrooms was way off from how often I was actually getting into classrooms. I thought I'm getting into 3 classrooms a day every day. And then I looked at my records and it's more like 3 once a week or 3 every 2 weeks, right? Because stuff comes up, you plan to get into classrooms, you try to get into classrooms, you think it's going to be 3 and it's only 1. You think it's going to be 5 days a week and it's only 2 days a week. And like we just overestimate how often we're going to actually get into classrooms. And I really want to empower you today to get into classrooms frequently and consistently, because without that, the rest of this becomes hypothetical, right? If we're not actually getting into classrooms, it doesn't matter how good our model is, right? If you have the most powerful feedback in the world, but you rarely ever get into classrooms, it's not going to have that much of an impact. So I don't want to downplay the power of that frequency of getting into classrooms 3 times a day or roughly 500 times a year, because a lot of this comes through just, the amount that we're in classrooms. The second characteristic that goes right with that is brief. These visits cannot be an hour. You cannot spend all day in classrooms. You have too much else going on. So we're talking 5, 10, 15 minutes at most per visit here. And if most people sit down and look at their day and think, okay, what do I have going on? Could I get into 3 classrooms for 5 minutes each? Give me a yes in the chat if you could get into classrooms. Like if you look at the total amount of time you have in the day, could you spare 5 minutes 3 times in a day? Yeah. Pretty much everybody would say yes. If not, there may be some other things you could do to work with your team, to work with your office staff. Now, it may be that you don't have any free time during the day. Like I didn't ask if you have free time. I don't think anybody has any free time when they're not doing anything. But I think we all understand the importance of prioritizing and finding little times when we could get into classrooms. But they have to be little. That's the thing. Where people overshoot, where people overcommit, is they try to block off hours and hours a day for walkthroughs, and it becomes unsustainable, right? And the first time you realize, okay, my 2-hour block that I carved out is going to be destroyed by this emergency meeting that got called, or I have to go to the district office, or just something came up, it's not going to be sustainable. And if we keep those visits short, it's much easier to move them around, it's much easier to squeeze them in, and it's much more sustainable. At the same time, though, we don't want this to just be making an appearance, right? I don't just want to be visible. Being visible is great on the first day of school. It's great on Monday. It's great once, but we want, over time, we want this to be actually substantive. We want to have time for a conversation. And Alana's asking a great question. When can we then talk to the teachers about the visit? So 2 answers to that. Neither of them is especially easy. I think we can talk on the spot if there's something to talk about on the spot, and if the lesson allows for it, or we can come back later, lunch, prep period, recess, after school. That is the hard part, obviously, is finding a time to come back. I am going to give you a tool that will make that a little bit easier, though. So stay tuned for the note cards. You can download those and mark when teachers are teaching and when their prep is and when their lunch is, so that you can plan that out a little bit ahead of time, right? So you can say, okay, I need to stop by this person's classroom before their prep period, so that if I need to come back during their prep period to talk about it, then the sequence is right there. But we want to make sure we have time to have that conversation, to listen to the teacher, because otherwise, if I'm just going around giving gold stars all the time, that's not really going to be very impactful. And yeah, the first key was frequent, 3 visits a day, 500 visits a year. The fourth key is to keep things open-ended. And again, this is where intrinsic motivation comes in, and this is where our guilt and our hesitation comes in, where we realize, I don't want to just give directive feedback all the time. I don't want to tell people what they're doing wrong. I want to actually have a conversation with people. I want this to be open-ended. I want to hear what the teacher's thinking is. I want to get a sense of their decision-making, and I want to help them sharpen their professional judgment. And that means the type of conversation we have really is open-ended, and it's not just me filling out a form, right? If you Google walkthrough form, you will find dozens and dozens of forms that people have created. I made probably half a dozen or more versions for myself of walkthrough forms, and never did any teacher ever say, Justin, It was so nice to see you in my classroom today. I want to especially thank you for filling out that form about me. That just made my day that you filled out a form. Now, what do people thank you for? Let me know what you have done that people have thanked you for. They said, that was really nice that you, what? What do they like? What do they remember when you get into classrooms and, leave a nice comment, say something that makes an impact on people? What is it that people do like if it's not forms? Let me know what you have done that people have really remembered. Yeah, participating in the lesson, asking about a family member, being a human being in the classroom, right? And that's what I feel like forms get in the way of a lot of the time. Interacting with students, genuinely listening, participating, showing interest in their life, in their students. Do you leave anything behind for the teacher? Yeah, visiting to watch a performance, coming at a good time when they've got something great going on. Anything you leave behind for teachers, let me know. Positive comments and notes, little candy. Yeah, leave a note card. There it is. Handwritten notes. Handwritten notes, I think, is really the critical thing, and not a form, not a non-carbon form or something that we're checking a box on, but an actual handwritten note. I've noticed teachers save those. They put them on their bulletin boards. They tape them to their desks. They tape them to the wall. They save them for years because I think this is because teachers are so starved for adult attention and just other adults noticing the good work that they're doing. So handwritten notes, I think, go a long way. I'll give you a template that you can quickly customize for just kind of a school mascot type blank note card, not a form, but a blank note card. And I think that that kind of open-ended just conversation goes a long way. We do want these to be evidence-based, and we'll talk about how to work up to taking more detailed notes. We do want to actually talk about what happened in the classroom, because I don't know if you have any teachers like this, but I had some teachers who loved to talk philosophy, but never liked to talk about their actual practice. I had especially some male teachers. Give me a yes in the chat if you have some people who love to talk education philosophy. They love to talk about the politicians in the state capitol, and they love to talk about society these days and kids these days, but they don't like to talk about their own practice. Right. Yes. I see lots of yeses here. So if you have people like that, it is very important to anchor our conversations in what actually happened in the lesson. So, hey, I noticed that or I saw this, I saw that, it seemed like this. We're talking about evidence of what's actually happening, to stay away from that armchair philosophizing and just chit chat, because that is not going to change practice. If we're just talking in the abstract, we need to talk about what actually happened. And we need to talk about what happened in reference to our evaluation criteria, because we don't want to be in a situation where we just go around second guessing everyone and say, oh, you think you're good? Well, I think you're not so great. That's not a good relationship to have with your teachers. It's much better to have a shared set of expectations and say, this is what we're working toward. This is our instructional vision. These are our criteria. Let's talk about how things are going relative to those criteria. So we're looking at criteria and we're looking at evidence and having a conversation about how they fit together. And when we have that as the goal that we've set, the table that we've set, we can have some great conversations, some really rich evidence-based conversations, instead of what I think has been a lot of people's experience of classroom walkthroughs, which is where we play this game, and I call it the fake feedback game. And it gets back to that idea of wows and wonders, of filling out a form, of warm and cool feedback, where we each have a job to do. We each have a role to play, and it's my job as the instructional leader to give some feedback, and it's the teacher's job to awkwardly smile and nod and say, oh, yes, thank you very much. I will definitely work on that. And you think, no, you definitely won't. I know we're both just playing a game here. We have all played that game. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but I certainly remember feeling like I had to play that game, whether the other teacher was doing great or whether they were kind of middle of the road or whether they were not doing so great. And sometimes we even give a specific format to that game. I call this the feedback sandwich. Give me a yes in the chat if you have been told or trained, or if you've heard to give the feedback sandwich. I've heard this from lots of places. I can't find anyone who actually takes credit for it. I don't know where this came from. Yes, the military has another name that is not suitable for publication for this, but the idea of starting with a compliment, put your suggestion in the middle, and then close with another compliment. Like the meat of the sandwich is in the middle, sandwiched between those compliments. And we know that that's coming, right? When we're playing the fake feedback game, we know the first compliment, it's just to butter you up, right? It's not really sincere. The suggestion in the middle, well, that's expected to, and who knows how seriously to take it. And then the last compliment, we know that's just kind of there to be the bread around the sandwich. And people don't really know what we really mean, what we really think when we use that artificial format, when we have that ratio of 2 compliments to 1 suggestion. And I have seen people, when I've made the mistake of giving a feedback sandwich, the feedback in the middle, like the suggestion in the middle, sometimes I was kind of grasping at straws. I was really struggling to come up with something to say. And yet the teacher, depending on their personality and where they were in their career and things like that, they might take that incredibly seriously. They might stay up late that night figuring out how to respond to that feedback. Have you ever gotten like a 2-page email from a teacher after an observation where they feel like maybe they were misunderstood, or they really just want you to understand what you saw, or they want you to know that they took your feedback very seriously, and you think, it's not my goal to get people to stay up late and totally redo everything and write me a 2-page email. Like, that's not the goal of this. And we realize that some of our personalities respond to this, in more dramatic ways than other. But like, this is not my goal here. I don't want to scare people. I don't want to give people this kind of giant reaction. I want to just have good conversations, just real professional conversations about their practice. Like, does that seem like a reasonable goal to strive for, to just have good conversations about their practice? Let me know in the chat if that sounds like a good goal to you, and we'll talk about how to get there. I think it's worth thinking in a little bit more depth about feedback, though, because, again, we inherit a lot of expectations about feedback, and we acquire a lot of assumptions about what a feedback conversation should look like, especially when it comes to directive feedback. And I told you earlier that my co-author, Heather, kind of hesitated to give a lot of directive feedback in her very small school. They had very close relationships. She knew everybody really well. It doesn't always work very well to give traditional kind of top-down feedback. And that can work, right? Traditional feedback can work. So please don't hear me saying that traditional feedback is always a bad idea. What I'm instead saying is that traditional feedback works under very specific conditions, right? If I go into a classroom, I can observe. I don't necessarily have to talk to the teacher and ask, hey, what are you working on, or what do you want feedback on? I can just observe. And I can kind of put on a doctor's hat and diagnose and prescribe, what's going on in this teacher's practice, what might be wrong, what do they need to do differently, what do they need to fix, and I can give warm and cool feedback on that. Now, that again can work, but if I have that kind of medical hat on, if I'm playing that kind of diagnose and prescribe role and implementing that medical model, there are a number of things that can go wrong, right? I can make mistakes as a diagnostician, as a doctor. I can kind of misunderstand what I'm doing, and doctors have to have malpractice insurance. We don't have malpractice insurance for giving bad instructional feedback, but that was always something that I, really took seriously as an administrator. Like, what if I give people feedback that sends them in the wrong direction? It's not difficult to go in the wrong direction with our feedback. And if we think about medicine as a metaphor here, if I don't know the history, if I don't pay close enough attention, if I don't stay long enough, if I don't diagnose what's going on correctly, if I don't come up with a good prescription, and if I don't follow through and make sure that prescription works, then that medical treatment is not going to make things better. So let me know in the chat, what makes traditional feedback work? Think about the kind of feedback that you've received that was helpful, the kind of feedback that you have given that was helpful, and think about that kind of medical diagnose and prescribe mindset or paradigm. What made it work? And let me know in the chat if you would. What makes traditional feedback work? Yeah, open-ended questions, honesty, good one. I love it. More of a conversation. That helps more than the documentation. We will talk a little bit about documentation, but yeah, the conversation definitely needs to play the primary role. Yeah, is there a goal that we're supporting? Is it direct and clear? Is there a genuine relationship? Absolutely. Are we coaching? Yeah, lots of good stuff here. So for the feedback itself, here are a couple things that come to mind for me. And again, so many good ones in the chat. Objective, honest, absolutely. In order to use that medical model correctly and give traditional feedback, we have to have good evidence, right? If we didn't pay attention, if we didn't really get a sense of what was going on, we're not going to have good feedback. We have to have a relationship with the teacher and understand the teacher. We have to know who we're observing. That's why I'm not honestly a big fan of video-based calibration exercises. I think we lose a lot when we don't actually know the teacher. I think it's really important to actually know the person that you're observing and build that relationship with them and get a sense of their practice and their rapport with kids and how they've set up their classroom, how they've set up the year, things like that. We have to have expertise, right? We have to have expertise as teachers, as people who know our student population. We have to have expertise in different subject areas, or at least we have to recognize the pedagogy that's in use in different subject areas. Nobody's an expert in everything. We do have to have a certain amount of expertise. The teacher has to be open to it to some extent, right? If you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you what to do and then you don't do it, you're not going to benefit from that treatment. So for the medical model to work, the teacher has to be receptive to the feedback and has to actually follow through. They have to get support. Let's see, relatable and applicable questions that warrant responses. Jason says, yeah, absolutely. So this is not always the case, right? If this works, if we're able to take a look at a teacher's practice and then talk with them about it, we may be able to come up with some things that they should change. But I think we also need some different paradigms for looking at practice, and especially when it comes to evidence, right? Like we are not doing MRIs on people's practice, right? We have a limited vantage point when we get into classrooms. And I really think in terms of kind of the fundamental limits of the observability of practice, right? Traditional feedback is based on evidence, but we're limited, we're hampered by how much is actually observable. So I want to give you a different metaphor for thinking about practice. Not that we're omniscient, that we're a video camera or anything like that when we get into classrooms, but I want to share with you my favorite metaphor for looking at teacher practice. The teacher practice is like an iceberg. And in an iceberg, based on the density of ice and the density of water, only about 10% of an iceberg is visible above the surface. And I think the same is true for teaching practice. About 90% of teaching practice is hidden beneath the surface. Let me know in the chat, what are some aspects of teaching that are hidden beneath the surface that you can't observe directly when you're in the classroom? Planning is a big one. Absolutely. Planning happens outside of class time, hopefully. I've given some feedback to a teacher that was planning during class time. That didn't work out too well. But planning, yeah, happens outside of class time, not directly observable. Yeah, the pre-learning that students did before the lesson, any intervention and differentiation, student circumstances, and what the teacher has done to build a relationship with that student and their family, what happened before the lesson, at the beginning of the day. Ooh, these are good. You guys are good at thinking about the rest of the iceberg there. And I don't know exactly which evaluation system you use in your location. I'm most familiar with the Danielson framework and the 4 domains: planning and preparation, learning environment, learning experiences, and principal teaching. And those had different names when I was a principal, but those I think are what they are currently. Planning and preparation and the environment that the teacher sets up are not directly observable. And even if we think about what happens during the lesson, the classroom management, the delivery of instruction, there are aspects to that practice that are not observable directly either. Charlotte Danielson thinks of teaching. I think I have a quote from her on this later, but she thinks of teaching as primarily cognitive work. And if we think of teaching as kind of a song and dance where, you get up on stage and you perform for your students, then of course it makes sense to see teaching as something that you can just directly observe and score and judge without talking to the teacher. But if we think about teaching as primarily cognitive work, as intellectual work, well, you can't see thinking. You can only get at teachers' thinking by talking with them about their practice, observing and then talking. So I think we have to be mindful of that, and we have to not reduce what the teacher is doing to just the parts we can see. And I call this tendency observability bias. And we put the definition for this in our book, Mapping Professional Practice. But I say observability bias is the tendency that we have to focus on what's easiest for us to observe and document, rather than pay attention to what teachers are actually thinking about, those key decisions, that professional judgment that they are exercising. We have to be very careful about observability bias, because especially when we're documenting, when we're looking for things to write down, it's easy for us to miss things that are just by their very nature invisible to us. So I hope that's a helpful metaphor for thinking about practice, and a helpful kind of mindset to have, that only about 10% is visible to us. Only about 10% happens when we're in the room, is actually perceptible. Thinking is not directly visible. Only about 10% is something that we can notice. And yet we can access that other 90% by using the visible 10% as a place to land. So the evidence-driven approach to classroom walkthroughs still starts with that 10% that is visible, that is observable, that we can actually use to anchor our conversation. But then the rest we get at through conversation. It is hidden from us until we engage with the teacher in conversation. So when I use the term feedback, I'm always talking about a conversation. It's not something that we write up in advance. It's not a form that we fill out. It is a conversation. At this point, I would love to know what thoughts you have, what questions you have. I'll grab a drink of water here, and then we'll talk about good questions. But let me know what sticks out for you so far. And we are right on track. So thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for the great answers. Let me know what you think so far. Let's talk about questions, because it is not enough to share evidence. It is a good starting point. It is good to have our questions anchored in the evidence, again, so we don't drift away into philosophy and abstractions. We want to talk about what people are actually doing. Yeah, lots of great questions coming in here. We'll get to some of these later on, but when do we have these conversations? Yeah, there's no easy answer to that. Part of it is keeping the visit itself short, Ayana, and making sure that it happens early enough in the day that we can come back and talk with the teacher if we can't talk immediately. And I think the other part of that answer is sometimes letting it go, right? If you don't get to talk with the teacher every single time, it's going to feel weird at first to not come back and have a chat with them, but that's just the reality. And I don't want that to stop you. Sometimes people are like happy to see you, but they don't really need to talk to you, and you don't need to talk to them. So it's okay to let it go as well. I would always prefer to have a conversation, but yeah, that's not always possible. We'll talk about note-taking. We'll talk about documentation. Yeah, the conversations can take more time. At the same time, we don't want to overshoot and let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? So if you have this huge vision for how great your feedback conversations are going to go, I want to encourage you to squeeze your expectations down to the bare minimum. Like, what if I just showed up in the classroom just to make an appearance and that was it? Well, let's get that figured out first, and then maybe you can do a little bit more. But we want to start with sustainability. So that's why we talked about brief and frequent first of all, because the rest of this just becomes imaginary if we can't make it into classrooms. So to whatever extent you have to make this more streamlined for yourself to get started, absolutely, please do. So keep those questions coming in, and we'll get to them as we go along. We want to start with evidence, and I have 10 questions for you that may be the best thing that you take away from this webinar. Feel free to take a screenshot. We also have these on a free download, which is our classroom visit note cards. These are the 10 questions that you can use as examples. You can modify these. You can use your own. But notice what's in the middle of every one of these questions. What do you think goes in the brackets in each of these questions? The context question, the decision question. What goes in the middle? There's a blank there. Yeah, what you saw. The evidence is what goes, yeah, what the teacher did, what the students did, what you noticed, and sometimes it's worded that way. I noticed that blank. So we're starting with evidence. We're anchoring it in the evidence. And then notice the rest of each of these questions. Talk to me about that. What were you thinking? What was your take? What went into that? How did that compare? Tell me about that. What did you think of that? How did you feel about that? What links do you see to our instructional framework? What effect did you think it had? All of these are open-ended questions. There's no correct answer. You don't need the teacher to email you later with this. These are just conversation starters for open-ended questions. And you can download these at principalcenter.com/notecards. We were actually selling these for a long time, and just recently we decided to make them free again because I just don't want there to be any barrier to people getting these. So principalcenter.com/notecards, and there are a couple of different pages. On the back, there's a page that allows you to print the questions on the back of every note card, 4 to a page. And then on the front, you have a choice of a couple of different options for the teacher's schedule. So if you're on a secondary school schedule, you'll want to use the one all the way to the right and the foremost card that says name, period, and so on. If you have an irregular kind of elementary style schedule, you might want to use the one that says weekly schedule that's further to the left. Just use whichever works for you. I personally prefer the one that's to the right and at the front, because that seems to give you the best sense of what each teacher's schedule is. But you want to write down what they're teaching at each time of day. When are what are they doing first period, second period, or if you're on an elementary schedule, when are they in the classroom, what subject are they doing first thing, and then before recess and after recess. And the magic of those note cards is that they help you informally plan your visits. You can take those note cards at the beginning of the day and take 3 of them off the stack and say, okay, here are the teachers that I'm going to visit today. This is my mission for the day, is to go visit these 3 teachers. And you can even involve your office staff in helping you. You can even involve your whole admin team. If you have one big stack for your whole team, probably what I would do is I would divide these up based on who you evaluate. So don't try to visit everybody. If you have 120 teachers, don't try to visit them all personally. Divide it up the way you divide up your evaluations, and visit 3 people a day, and have your office staff hand you those physical note cards. Say, Justin, these are the people that you need to go visit today. Give these back to me at the end of the day. I want to see the date recorded on there. So deputize your office staff to hold you accountable for getting into classrooms, even if it's just for a minute. Then you write the date that you visited. You can come up with your own symbols and things like that for if you got a chance to talk or if you sent the teacher an email, whatever you want to do. But note those on the note card, and that will be all the documentation you need that you've been getting into classrooms. And this can be something that you show your boss and say, hey, look, this is when I've been into classrooms. These are the different subjects that I've seen. And because you're recording the different subjects, you'll bypass a mistake that a lot of people make, which is to only see the first thing that teachers teach in the morning, right? Like for elementary principals, it is very common to only ever see literacy block, right? Because you go first thing in the morning, you've blocked out time, and that's when you're getting into classrooms, and you will only see the same subject. Well, I realized one time I'd gone months and months without seeing a particular teacher's math instruction. I thought, I've really got to make sure that I rotate this. So when you break it out by subject like that, you can make sure that you are rotating. So go to principalcenter.com/notecards and you can grab those. One other thing that you can use if you want to leave a note for the teacher, this is just a blank note card. So there's no form, there's no checklist or anything. And this is just a 1-page Word document with placeholder images. And you can swap in your logo, your school mascot, whatever you want to put on there to make a nice little just kind of letterhead note card. You can get those printed online if you want to, or if you have a color printer or just whatever you want to do. But that'll give you two a page. Feel free to take a screenshot and download that. I don't know that I have a handy link to that anywhere on the website, so that might be one that you want to take a screenshot of. But yeah, grab those and make good use of them. And then get into conversations with teachers, right? Start small. Don't make a big deal out of things at first. But as you start to just kind of naturally get into deeper conversations, let the teacher talk, right? And treat the teacher talk seriously. Treat it as evidence and ask for elaboration, right? When we have these conversations, the more the teacher is talking, the better. It gets back to that old idea that whoever is doing the most talking is doing the most learning. And I find that a lot of us struggle to get into classrooms because we're the ones doing all the work, right? It's really hard for me to observe and take notes and come up with feedback and deliver that feedback and write it all up. Like, I don't need to be doing all of that myself. If this is a conversation, I want to hear from the teacher. So get the teacher talking, get the teacher to elaborate. And one particular tip on that is if you want to know why somebody did something, don't ask them why. Don't say, why'd you do that? Because that's going to make people defensive. If you want to know why, ask them how. Ask a how question. Talk to me about how you decided. Talk to me about how you came up with that. Talk to me about how you formed the groups. If you want to know why, ask how. And that'll get you away from defensiveness and justification, and it'll get you the rich explanations that you're looking for. And the richer those explanations are, the better evidence you have of the teacher's practice, right? Sometimes we ask people a question and they give us kind of a thin answer, and then we think, I'm not really sure if they, are really on top of this issue, or if they're really aware of this issue. Like if you had asked me as a first-year teacher, imagine first-year teacher Justin, saying, Justin, tell me about your use of formative assessment. How do you use formative assessment? Okay, it's a how question, not do you use formative assessment? Because if you say, do you use formative assessment? I'm going to say, yes, I do. And then if you say how, I'm going to say, I use formative assessment. And as a first-year teacher, I didn't know what formative assessment was. I learned in grad school what formative assessment was, believe it or not. And if I started to answer that question, say, I use formative assessment to formatively assess my students' understanding of our objectives, and it seems like there's not much there, well, then I know this is an area where we need to do some professional development. This is an area where that person needs to grow. But if I could give you, a 10-minute discourse on formative assessment, then you know a whole lot more about my practice as a result. So look for the thinness or the thickness of people's explanations as a really important form of evidence. All right, one more thing on questions is that you can ask broken questions. I've given you my 10 feedback questions, but you don't have to use those as they're written. As long as you're sharing some sort of evidence and asking some sort of open-ended question, it doesn't even have to be a complete question. You can trail off. You can say, so tell me about how you, and that's a natural thing to do in conversation. Like listen to people talk, listen to yourself in conversations with your friends. It is very common to trail off in a question and not ask a complete question, because that's just how conversations work, right? Ask a partial question, listen. Part of listening is that we have to stop talking at some point. So you can say, tell me more about that. Talk to me about how you, and just kind of gesture. Tell me more about that. How do you do that? And as a result, you will have easier and better conversations. So don't think of this as something that you have to come up with completely on your own. You do not have to come up with all of the feedback on your own. You don't have to come up with compliments and criticisms. You can share your notes with the teacher when you get to that point. I wouldn't start with a lot of notes, but you can share your notes with the teacher. And teachers just need the opportunity to talk with you, and they need your support. So let me know what questions you have about any of that. Let me know what strikes you. I did want to talk a little bit about scheduling, because we said right at the very beginning that the traditional advice to block off time and just say, okay, 9 to 11 every day, I'm in classrooms, that tends to not work very well for everybody. Let me know in the chat. Give me a yes or no. Does blocking off time work for you? I'm going to guess that it works for a certain percentage of people and doesn't work for others. But let me know if you just mark off some time on your calendar, like, can you stick to that, or does something come up? Give me a yes or no. I found that it does work for, for a certain number of people. Honestly, if you're an assistant principal, if you're in a secondary school, it tends to not work as well because you get interrupted more. If you are in a pretty low key building, it might work a little bit better for you. It works most of the time, works until something comes up. That's the rub, right? It works until something comes up. It worked in high school, but not in elementary. Yeah. Try to list which teachers I want to see each day and look at their schedules and mine, but mine always changes. Yeah, and that's why I don't recommend really writing out the whole week in advance and saying, okay, on Thursday at 9 a.m., I'm going to go visit Mrs. Smith, because who knows what's going to happen between now and Thursday. Mrs. Smith might not be here. They might be on a field trip. All kinds of things come up. So I want to encourage you in general to be flexible with this, because that is probably going to get you farther than really detailed and strict planning and sticking to it. Yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. What you want to shoot for here is 3 visits a day. And if that means not blocking off time, that's okay. If blocking off time works for you, keep doing it. I'm not saying to stop if it works for you, but don't feel guilty if blocking off time is not working for you, because there is not something wrong with you. This is completely normal for this not to work. I've also heard advice to spend full days in classrooms. Give me a yes in the chat if you have heard that advice, to spend like all day Tuesday and all day Thursday in the classroom. And I have been to workshops where people have said that, and I know the people who are saying that in those workshops, and they have not been principals. I personally think this is not the optimal schedule. Again, if you do this and it works for you, keep doing it. But most people find that this is completely unsustainable for themselves, because people need you, right? You are in demand on your campus. And of course, there are things you can do to delegate and empower other people to make decisions without you. But the reality is, as an administrator, as an instructional leader, as an instructional coach, whatever role you play, people need you for a lot of different stuff. And when you say, I'm going to be in classrooms for the next 7 hours, that puts other people in a very difficult position, and they know it and we know it. And that creates a lot of pressure to not get into classrooms. So it is not my recommendation that you do this. It is convenient to some extent to have that predictability, to have that consistency, to kind of mentally pre-commit to resisting distractions. Yeah, have them pretend you're not there. I've done that before. Sometimes you just need to get stuff done in classrooms, get some observations done. But the pressure is very real to go deal with that other stuff. So there are some pros and cons. I think in the con category for blocking off huge amounts of time, one thing that is a little bit of a downside is that it's not as random. Like, I like getting into classrooms at a kind of random variety of times to see different subjects when people are not expecting me. If they know, oh, it's 9:45, so there aren't going to be any more classroom visits, I'm not going to see Justin the rest of the day. That's not really ideal from a supervision perspective. I want to see a variety of times. I don't want people to know when to expect me. And I don't want to have just one shot for getting into classrooms. If 9 to 10 was my only slot for the day and something happens during that time, the fire department shows up and we need to do a fire drill, and I don't have a backup time because my calendar is booked up the rest of the day, that's not going to be great. And I'm not going to be consistent in getting into classrooms every day. And we've got to really be prepared for interruptions because, Murphy's Law just says, we're going to, if anything can go wrong, it will. We are going to get interrupted. If you are a principal who never gets interrupted, something is weird about your school. Don't tell anyone or they will all want your job. But it is completely normal to get interrupted all the time. And here's where my thinking about scheduling is different from advice that you might have heard elsewhere. I believe that walkthroughs are a little bit flexible. It is okay to not get into classrooms at the exact moment when you thought to yourself that morning that you were going to. Most things can wait a few minutes, right? The interruption itself might be able to wait a few minutes, might not be able to wait a few hours. And there are some emergencies, some interruptions that you do need to deal with right away. But we want to be as flexible as possible and still get everything done. So one tool that I wanted to share with you is what I call the interruption matrix. This is a long, detailed list of possible interruptions that might come up. This is a free download. Just type that in and you can print that out and talk about it with your office staff. Let's see, matrix. I'll put it in the chat here. Matrix PDF. Somebody let me know if that works. That should just be a printable PDF file. There's also a blank page for you to come up with your own scenarios based on things that tend to happen in your school. But there are things like, a student discipline issue, or a parent comes to the office and is angry, or there's a fight, or the fire department shows up. And you can decide with your office staff, what do we do when that happens? If Justin is in classroom observing, do we interrupt? Do we consult? Do we, send a quick text message but handle it? Do we document it for later, or do we handle it without even letting you know? Like, one of the things that I really appreciated about our office staff was there were things they knew they could handle and they didn't have to tell me about, right? Like if a kid comes in and needs a Band-Aid, I don't need to know if a kid needs a Band-Aid. I need to know if we have like a head injury or an ambulance coming or anything like that. But people have just wildly different expectations for this kind of thing. You can have two office staff members who see the same kid come in with the same issue and handle it in wildly different ways. And we just need to get on the same page about some of those interruptions, and that can really cut down on a lot of them. So grab that tool, talk about that with your admin team and your office staff, whoever answers the phone and decides whether to interrupt you when you're in classrooms. This can be a great tool for cutting down on those interruptions. All right, some scheduling specifics. I want to give you two versions of a schedule here, just to give you a sense of what this could look like throughout the day. On an elementary schedule, I like having some little times spread throughout the day before and after when you're already out of the office, right? So when the school day first begins, I think that's a great time to get into classrooms, to greet people, see how their morning is starting. And after that, I think it's fine to get into the office and do some office work. When recess is about to start, I think that's a great time to get into classrooms on your way to recess. Maybe some classrooms that don't have recess at that time, they're in the middle of something, or maybe they are transitioning. That can be valuable to see too. But spread these throughout the day and look for times when you're already going to be out of the office to go to the cafeteria, the playground, some meeting, and don't feel like you have to not spend time in the office working. It is perfectly appropriate to spend time in the office working. You can get a lot done if you just squeeze those visits in on your way to and from. And that applies to secondary as well. Of course, secondary, you have more of a bell schedule, you have more of a period schedule. And I think two great times that people often overlook are the beginning of class and the end of class, right? If you're in hallways to supervise passing period, well, it's great to pop in and see the end of one class, supervise in the hallway, and then pop into another classroom and see the beginning of that. And if you do that once or twice a day, you're well on your way to being in classrooms 500 times a year. So plenty of opportunity to get into classrooms briefly. It, of course, can be in the middle of class. That's great too. But don't feel like the beginning and end of class are bad times, because there's always some benefit there. All right, so let me know what some of your thoughts are on scheduling. When are some good times for you to get into classrooms? And I'm especially interested in hearing from people who don't work on all of the campuses. Like if you're itinerant, if you're central office based, what does it look like for you to get into classrooms? You may have to drive to get to a campus. You may have a limited amount of time there. But let me know what works for you scheduling wise, and then we'll wrap things up with a few thoughts on documentation, and we'll do some Q&A. I know we'll probably have to run, but I can stay a little bit longer and answer anything we didn't get to. Just wanted to talk briefly about documentation. I think leaving people a nice note is plenty. Marking down on your note cards that you were there is plenty. If you get into the groove of this though, and really get to the point where you're starting to take more detailed notes, I think those notes are a great thing to share with the teacher, not as any kind of pro and con or warm and cool feedback, but just your factual notes. And this is going to feel weird to people the first time you do it, but you can actually just give people your raw notes. You could even take a picture with your phone and give them your original handwritten notes if your handwriting is slightly better than mine and it would be legible. Those notes can be very, very valuable for that conversation. They can be valuable for later reference, and share them with the teacher, right? Teachers don't like seeing you write things down, but not having what you wrote down. So if you ever take notes, my recommendation is share them with the teacher so that they're not wondering, they're not worrying. And more specifically, I recommend that you not start taking notes until your third visit to each teacher's classroom. So first time around, don't try to give any feedback. Just pop in and say hi. Second time, stay a little bit longer, talk a little bit more. And then in your third cycle of visits to each person, that's when you can start to take notes. So hope that is helpful. Let's see. Yeah, new teachers can learn by noting what you're focused on observing. Yeah, love it. All right, so I think that is a good place to stop with documentation, and we'll end here thinking about the different roles that we can play. And hopefully, I've given you some perspective on some different roles that you can play in terms of being a conversation partner, in terms of promoting intrinsic motivation. You know, and some of the people who are here today are coaches. It's not your job to be a supervisor; it's your job to be a coach. And certainly, even if you are in a supervisor kind of boss role, you want to be a coach, right? We want to play that reflective feedback role as often as possible. Sometimes, though, there's a third hat that we need to wear. And sometimes we just need to listen to people and realize when they need us to change something. I'll never forget, we had a wonderful kindergarten team at my school, and there was an anti-bullying curriculum that they were supposed to be teaching. And I was talking with them about how it was going. I'd stop by to see the lessons. And they said to me, Justin, like, we're really having a hard time getting to these lessons because we come back from lunch and then there's this really awkward short block of time and then we go out to recess and just the schedule was not conducive. And I realized that giving them feedback about how they needed to try harder to fit this curriculum in was not going to get us where we needed to be. What needed to happen was I needed to change the schedule. Some of the best feedback that you get as an instructional leader will not be about the teacher, you know, what the teacher does. It'll be about things that you can change as a leader to make the teacher more successful, to put them in conditions where they can succeed. So think about these three roles, keep these in mind, and switch between them anytime you need to, right? Sometimes we do need to be directive. Sometimes we need to tell people, hey, you do need to plan your lessons. You need to not yell at the kids. Sometimes we need to play more of a coaching role and ask those reflective questions. But even, you know, if you're not sure, you can always ask an open-ended question and then decide based on the teacher's answer, do I need to be more directive about this, or can I stay in more of a coaching stance? All right, so we'll stop there. That's what I have for you. In terms of recommended action items, I really want to challenge you to visit 3 classrooms a day. You can do it. I've seen lots and lots of people do it. You know, hundreds of people have done this and have told me about it, that they're able to get into classrooms consistently when they follow those 7 keys and let go of everything else when it comes to classroom walkthroughs. Have good conversations, focus on the evidence, make your questions open-ended, play those different roles, boss, coach, leader. Use those note cards to keep yourself on track. Use those feedback questions to have good conversations. And I'll stop there. Yeah, so I'll go back to those note cards with the questions on them, and that'll have the same link. And let me know what questions you have. I'd be happy to answer those. There are the questions for you again. Feel free to take a screenshot there. Let's see. Yeah, forms. Yeah, if you do want to set up a Google form, I've got an article on my website. If you search for how to set up a Google form, you can definitely do that. There are lots of things you can do. Yeah. So if you have a system, and I'll say this as just a general rule of thumb, if you have something that's working, don't stop doing it. But if you have something that you think should be working and it's not working, hopefully I've shared something with you today that will help you get the tweak that you need to get consistent with it, because really this all comes down to frequency and consistency over time and ultimately sustainability. So, Arlen, I think we'll stop there.
Wonderful, Justin. Thank you so much. That was so much great information in a short amount of time. I really appreciate you being with us this afternoon. Loved all the strategies and the 7 keys to impactful classroom walkthroughs. It is a little after 4, so we don't really have time for questions. I know, Justin, you were good about answering chat questions as they came in. Is there anything, Justin, you would like me to send out with the recording?
Yeah, feel free to, if you want to grab any of those downloads, feel free to send them to people who registered.
Okay.
That would be fine, or just the links if that's easier. Feel free to attach the files, whatever would be helpful to people. So absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. I'll stop the recording now.